The Moral and Legal Status of Animals, Part 2, Animal Ethics. In Part 1 we briefly considered anthropocentrism, those ethical theories or frameworks that grant moral status only to human beings. According to this view, it's only humans and their well-being that count. Non-human entities, including animals, are not entitled to our moral consideration. They do not have moral status. If pressed, many people would reject a strictly anthropocentric approach to ethics and instead acknowledge that at least some non-human entities have moral status in their own right. They would, for example, agree that it's wrong to kill a kitten, even if doing so caused no harm whatsoever to any human. In other words, they would agree that the kitten has an inherent right to live regardless of its value to humans. On the other hand, there are many instances where most people would disregard the moral status of animals and even deny them any kind of moral status at all in favor of promoting the well-being and prosperity of humans. Common sense thinking appears deeply divided on the issue of animals and ethics. For example, you may be outraged when you read a story about the abuse of pets in the news, but when someone criticizes the conditions in which battery chickens or pigs are forced to live, your response may be that those affected are just animals and do not merit your concern. Philosophical opinion on the moral status of animals is similarly divided. We will examine the arguments in favor of each of the following positions. 1. Animals have no moral status. 2. Animals have some moral status, but less than humans. 3. Animals have moral status equal to humans. According to some anthropocentric ethical theories, animals lack moral status entirely. This is not to say that you're entitled to treat animals in any way you like. Animals do not deserve our moral consideration on their own, but they may deserve our consideration if their suffering could lead to suffering by humans. It would be wrong to cause a farm animal raised for meat to suffer if that suffering affects the quality of the meat for human consumption. It would be wrong to kick a dog if the dog belonged to another person who would be upset to see their pet in pain. The view that animals have no moral status can be justified in a number of different ways. 1. The natural superiority of humans. 2. Animals' lack of sentience. And 3. Animals' lack of will. The first justification for not granting animals moral status is the natural superiority of humans. This natural superiority is itself supported by several religious texts, including the Old Testament. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." Genesis 1:26. For many people, this is enough to support their anthropocentric position. And even for people who do not explicitly favor a religious worldview, the fact that many cultures, including Western culture, were for centuries dominated by the religious worldview means that the natural superiority of humans over animals is an element of what many see as common sense. It's a justification for refusing animals' moral status that is for many accepted without reflection. But even those who do reflect deeply upon the relationship between humans and animals deny animals' moral status. Some philosophers deny that animals have moral status due to their particular beliefs about the nature of the world and the proper place of its various inhabitants. According to Aristotle, for example, there is a natural hierarchy of living beings, with humans at the top. Aristotle believed that humans are naturally superior to animals because they have the capacity to use reason to guide their conduct, while animals lack this ability and must rely on instinct. He thus argued that the function of animals is to serve the needs of humans, and that humans do not owe any ethical obligation to animals. This belief in the natural superiority of humans is also reflected in quasi-scientific justifications for disregarding the interests of animals on the basis of the food chain. According to this view, if one kind of being regularly eats another kind of being, then the first is said to be higher on the food chain. If one being is higher than another on the food chain, then it's natural for that being to use the other to further its interests. Humans sit at the top of the food chain, and so their exploitation of other animals is justified. Since exploitation of animals is natural, it does not need any further moral justification. Pause the video and take a moment to consider the following question. In your opinion, does the placement of an entity lower in the food chain mean that they are not owed any ethical obligations by those higher in the food chain? Another reason to deny that animals have moral status is the belief that animals are not actually sentient, and therefore have no interests or well-being to take into consideration. Sentience here refers to a being's ability to subjectively perceive its environment and experience pain and suffering, or pleasure and comfort. A sentient being is able to receive internal sensation and information from its environment, and interpret this as either a positive or a negative emotion. Animals are not actually sentient and therefore lack moral status. One of the most well-known denials of animal sentience was developed by René Descartes. He argued that animals are mere automata, nothing more than complex machines made of muscle and bone that respond unthinkingly to stimulation. I specifically paused to show that if there were such machines with the organs and shape of a monkey or of some other non-rational animal, we would have no way of discovering that they are not the same as these animals. If you kick a dog, it will yelp. But this yelp does not mean that the dog actually felt pain. Rather, it's a mechanical response to the stimulus of being kicked. Although this theory may sound absurd, it's reflected in our approach to many animals today. Specific animal protection or welfare laws, for example, are generally not introduced until there's a scientific consensus confirming that a particular species of animal is sentient. And in debates about factory farming, some participants default to this Cartesian viewpoint when they claim that practices such as tail docking are not animal cruelty because animals don't feel pain the way we do. A third argument in favor of denying animals moral status is based on the claim that animals have no will. According to Immanuel Kant, so far as animals are concerned, we have no direct duties, as animals are not self-conscious, and they are merely as means to an end. That end is man. Kant argued that a person can be said to be doing the right thing only when they act with a good will, and they act with a good will when they choose to do something because it's their duty to do so. Both animals and humans have desires that can compel them to action, but only humans are capable of willing, that is, standing back from their desires and choosing which course of action to take. Animals lack this ability, and therefore animals lack wills. We owe ethical obligations only towards others who act with a good will, and since animals do not have wills at all, we do not owe them any ethical obligations. The second position to take in relation to animal ethics is that animals do have some moral status, but it's less than the moral status of humans. Many people today are of the view that animals are more than mere automata, and that, despite the differences between animals and humans, animals do have certain inherent entitlements to our moral consideration. We do have an obligation to act in the best interests of animals, as far as those interests are not inconsistent with human well-being. In other words, animals do have rights, but those rights are trumped by human interests. The argument in support of the claim that animals have moral status is a simple one. 1. If a being is sentient, then it has moral status. 2. Most animals are sentient. 3. Therefore, most animals have moral status. Generally speaking, the justification for attributing sentience to a being grows stronger the more similar it is to human beings. Pause the video and take a moment to consider the following question. Are all animals sentient? If not all animals, then which animals? The argument that the moral status of animals is not equal to the moral status of humans typically takes the following form. 1. humans have attribute X. 2. Animals lack attribute X. 3. Therefore, human interests override animal interests. Examples of attribute X include language and technology, rationality, autonomy and self-consciousness, the ability to act morally, or membership of a community. These are abilities or characteristics that humans have and animals lack. This reasoning can be used, and is frequently used, to justify the suffering and the killing of animals for food, transport, sport, and entertainment. Such suffering and killing should be avoided when it's unnecessary, since animals do have some moral status, but if it's for the benefit of human survival, or even merely for human pleasure, then it is morally justified. Pause the video and take a moment to consider the following question. What other properties possessed by humans and lacked by animals might be used to justify the characterization of animal moral status as being less than human moral status? The third possible position is that animals have a moral status equal to that of humans. According to some ethicists, animals not only have moral status, but also have the same moral status as human beings. There's no legitimate reason for placing humans and animals in different moral categories. Whatever argument is used to justify owing an ethical obligation to other humans also justifies owing an ethical obligation to animals. One well-known version of this argument is set out in the book Animal Liberation by Peter Singer. The publication of Singer's book in 1975 marked the beginning of the modern animal rights movement. In his book, Singer attacked the argument that the interests of animals should be given less weight than the interests of human beings. The gist of his argument is that anything that can be used to justify treating humans differently from animals can be used to justify treating some humans differently from other humans, and that since we are committed to treating all humans equally, it would be hypocritical and irrational not to treat animals as having equal moral status to humans. For example, we may believe that animals are inferior to humans because humans are more intelligent. But we don't reduce the moral status of other humans on the basis of their intelligence, so why do we do that to animals? Singer explained that persistently putting human interests ahead of non-human interests is no more than irrational speciesism. Racists violate the principle of equality by giving greater weight to the interests of members of their own race when there is a clash between their interests and the interests of those of another race. Sexists violate the principle of equality by favoring the interests of their own sex. Similarly, speciesists allow the interests of their own species to override the greater interests of members of other species. The pattern is identical in each case. The basic structure of Singer's argument is as follows. 1. To conclude that all and only human beings deserve a full and equal moral status, and therefore that no animals deserve a full and equal moral status, there must be some attribute that all and only human beings have that can grant such a claim. 2. Any attribute that only human beings have is an attribute that some human beings lack, the marginal cases. 3. Any attribute that all human beings have is an attribute that most human beings have as well. And 4. Therefore, there is no way to defend the claim that all and only human beings deserve a full and equal moral status. For example, it might be argued that only humans have full and equal moral status because only humans have the capacity to speak. In other words, it's the capacity to speak that entitles humans to ethical consideration by other humans. Animals cannot speak, and therefore it's morally acceptable to treat them differently from humans by, for example, eating them. But there are humans who cannot speak. Is it morally acceptable to eat mute humans? What is it then that separates all humans from all animals? This reasoning can be applied to any attribute that apparently distinguishes humans from animals. There are always some humans, marginal cases, who do not have that attribute. The only attributes that every single human being shares, being alive, breathing, needing to eat, and so on, are attributes shared by animals as well. The conclusion is either that not all human beings are equal, or that not only human beings are equal. Singer argues that since the first option is unacceptable, the only acceptable conclusion is that all animals, human or otherwise, are equal. Singer is a utilitarian, and his argument is used to justify the inclusion of animal interests in utilitarian calculations of overall well-being. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that states that the best action is the one that maximizes utility. Utility is defined in various ways, usually in terms of the well-being of sentient entities. When choosing between two or more possible courses of action, the right thing to do is the one that leads to the least suffering or pain and the most well-being or pleasure. Singer's claim is that when measuring the likely overall pain or pleasure caused by our actions, we must take into account the pain or pleasure of any animals affected by our actions, and not only that of the humans affected by our actions. For example, in deciding whether it is ethically acceptable to eat meat, we should weigh up the pleasure we experience when eating meat against the pain and suffering of the animal that had to die to provide that meat. If animals have equal moral status to humans, then the animal's entitlement to life outweighs our desire to eat what we choose, no matter how much we enjoy the taste, and it becomes unethical to eat meat for pleasure. Arguably, it would not be unethical to eat meat to survive. On the other hand, utilitarian reasoning can also be used to justify practices such as animal testing, even if animals are accorded equal moral status. If a small number of animals suffer and die as a result of scientific testing, but the outcome of the testing is a medicine that saves thousands of human lives, then, even if the animals have equal moral status, the good that is caused by the testing outweighs the bad, and animal testing is ethically acceptable. This has prompted some animal ethicists to reject utilitarian reasoning in favor of a rights-based approach, and to insist that since animals have equal moral status, they have an equal right to life and freedom from suffering, regardless of any potentially positive consequences of their suffering and death. As Tom Regan explains in The Case for Animal Rights, the fundamental differences between utilitarianism and the rights view are never more apparent than in the case of animals used in science. For the utilitarian, whether the harm done to animals in pursuit of scientific ends is justified depends on the balance of the aggregated consequences for all those affected by the outcome. If the resulting consequences would be at least as good as what are otherwise obtainable, then harmful experimentation is obligatory. The rights view takes a very different stand. No one, whether human or animal, is ever to be treated as if she were a mere receptacle, or as if her value were reducible to her possible utility for others. To do so is to violate the rights of the individual. That's why the harm done to animals in pursuit of scientific purposes is wrong. In the next part of this module, we'll consider our legal obligations towards animals and how they relate to our ethical obligations.